This is the Nokia N800 Internet tablet. Released the same year as the original iPhone and a full year before the first Android device went up for sale, it was one of the first ways you could browse the internet on a handheld device from the comfort of your own couch. It offers a full web browsing experience versus the stripped-down browsers that were sometimes crammed onto smaller devices of the era, and it retailed for about $400. This unit was graciously donated by good friend of the channel, Charles. Thanks, Charles. On the front of the unit, we have a 4.3-inch resistive touchscreen boasting a resolution of 800 by 480. This coincidentally happens to be the same resolution as the Asus EE PC I featured on the channel a couple of months ago. It also has stereo speakers on either side of the screen, and the left side features some physical buttons, including a D-pad, select button, home button, back button, and an options button. The display is fairly clear and bright, although the resistive touch membrane across the top of it has gotten pretty scuffed up over the years. Additional physical buttons are located on the top and include volume controls and a power switch, which are pretty small but they definitely do the job. The left-hand side of the unit features one of its more unique features. Rather than dealing with having a front-facing and rear-facing camera like modern devices do, the N800 houses a tiny little pop-out camera. It's capable of taking pictures and recording video at 640 by 480, but, as a neat little trick, it also rotates about 270 degrees, eliminating the need for two cameras. And who needs a Nintendo Switch when you've got the N800, which already sports one of its most exciting features? Wrapped around the bottom of the device is this handy 3-position kickstand, allowing it to sit at 2 different angles for media consumption or web browsing. And that kickstand isn't just for show. It also serves to protect the mini USB port on the side, which has an early implementation of USB on the go, allowing the N800 to act as a host and have devices connect to it. The Nokia N800 also has 2 expansion slots for full-size SD cards. One is tucked away underneath the kickstand and accessible via this little flap. The other is internal and is accessible through the battery compartment. Both are officially able to support 8 gigs of storage and unofficially able to support 32. When using an internal SD card, you can also assign part of the card to act as virtual memory to help with performance. You just activate it from the memory page in the settings menu. And speaking of internals, the N800 features the TI OMAP 2420 400MHz CPU. It was originally clocked at 330MHz, but it was brought up to its full 400MHz with an operating system upgrade a little while after launch. The processor is paired with 128 MB of RAM and 256 MB of internal storage. For wireless connectivity, it supports 802.11b and G wireless networks, as well as Bluetooth 2.0 for peripherals. While you could use your finger to activate the screen, the small size and overall less responsiveness means that you're going to have a pretty lackluster experience. To combat this, using the included stylus is a must. And despite its age, my unit still holds a pretty decent charge, running for 1 to 2 hours before needing to be plugged back in, which ends up being about half the life that was reported when it was new. The N800 came preloaded with the Maemo operating system, which is a customized version of Debian Linux. And even after all these years, the original app repository is still up and running, meaning you can load games right over the internet from the built-in menu. So, what can a 2007 internet tablet still do in 2021? Well, ordinary browsing is mostly out of the question. There are a few browsers available for it, but they're all over a decade out of date and don't support the latest security standards. But recently, Sean over at the Action Retro YouTube channel built a few websites to make browsing on older devices a little more comfortable. 68k.news is a Google News-style feed targeted at text-based browsers. It strips out all the more modern elements, allowing devices of just about any age to still be useful. He also put together a search page targeted at older machines, frogfind.com. Search for the site you want, and it does its best to render it in a fashion that should work on the majority of browsers with varying degrees of success. There are a few email clients available for the N800. And although I was able to get at least one of them up and running with a Gmail account, I wouldn't really recommend trying to access an account with more than a few dozen emails in it. With support, unofficially, for up to 32 gigs of storage via the external SD slot, multimedia playback definitely would have been a selling feature to me for this device. Back then, it would have blown my mind to have a device like this that I could load up all of my favorite content onto and stick it in my pocket. It's definitely something that I take for granted these days. And it was still able to play my current titles. I watched an entire episode of Lower Decks on it, and to my surprise, the picture looked quite good, even if the audio is a little quiet without headphones.
This is basically a resort compared to what the Klingons do to you. I'm sure it's not a big deal.
Since it has small, interchangeable batteries, I could also see a world where this thing would make a good alternative to a laptop for a student taking notes in class. And just imagine the cool factor of this setup on your desk. And, of course, there are games. Ports of varying quality and all sorts of homebrew are still available from the application catalog. Most of the games are akin to mid-range flash games of the era. And, of course, it also saw its fair share of emulators brought across. I started with NES emulation using the iNES emulator, and its performance wasn't great. The emulator is slow and struggles to keep a constant frame rate, and the audio is stuttery. Controls are handled via the directional pad on the left of the unit and touchscreen buttons mapped out on the LCD. Since the screen can only handle a single input at a time, it ends up being more of a novelty than anything. The story is similar as we move on to Game Boy emulation. I had hoped that a lower-powered console might deliver better results, but it wasn't meant to be. Frame rates are still inconsistent, as is the audio. And it's not just the timing of the audio that's bad, it's the sound itself. Finally, even though it struggled with earlier consoles, I decided to give the Super Nintendo emulation a shot. And it performed pretty much the same as the previous two. This leads me to believe that the issue with the other emulators might not be just the raw horsepower that the CPU can provide, but it might be a matter of code optimization. The emulators just aren't polished enough to deliver a great experience. The single-touch touchscreen really holds these emulators back. And while the N800 will happily pair with a modern 8-bit Bluetooth controller, none of the emulators allowed you to remap controls to the connected device. So you're stuck with what's included in the unit. I was excited to see that DOSBox had been ported to the N800, but unfortunately its performance is really slow. It lands somewhere between an 8086 and an 8088, which, although there are plenty of games and software that will run with that, the experience wasn't great. Doom performance was, of course, doomed. Commander Keen 1 is somewhat playable, but it feels like it runs about half speed. I managed to install Windows 3.11 on it, but it was mostly just to see what would happen. Of course, this version of Windows was never designed to run on a much slower processor, but it at least did successfully load, and I could get through the menus okay. In terms of higher quality ports, I was pleasantly surprised to find that the shareware version of Duke Nukem 3D had made its way onto the N800. They did their best with what controls are provided, but it ends up being a little awkward. You aim and look around by using the touchscreen and move using the D-pad, with firing being controlled by the select button. Unfortunately, it's lacking the signature Duke music, which really does change the atmosphere of the game. It may not be the greatest experience, but it's still pretty awesome to see Duke Nukem 3D running at full speed on such a small and portable device. Overall, I had a great time playing with the N800. While it is by no means a perfect device, its design and quirks just add to its charm. At first, I thought there wouldn't be much of a market for such a device today, but then I realized that it's essentially doing all the things that an iPod Touch does, filling that niche for the market that doesn't quite want a cell phone. So, in a way, the legacy of devices like this one continues to live on to this day. Thanks so much for sticking around till the end, and a special thanks to my Patreon supporters who help fund future episodes. That's it for this one, but I'll see you back here in a few weeks for another Print and Play Retrospective.